Most people don't think of strategy that way.
Developing a new strategy.
Strategic blind spots.
When strategy meets reality.
Strategy and innovations.
In the strategy world.
Drive their strategic goals.
And welcome back to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. Welcome back to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm delighted to have Matt Finch with me today. I've been trying to get Matt on this podcast for a long time, and I finally wrestled him to come onto the podcast. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Mike. Very pleased to be here.
Just for our guests, do you mind giving a bit of background, a bit of context of what you've been up to lately?
Yeah, for sure. I work in strategy and foresight mostly, but also negotiation and mediation. Essentially, I help stressed out people under conditions of uncertainty when they have a consequential decision to make. So I wear a number of hats. I'm an associate fellow at Saïd Business School, University of Oxford, where I work a lot with the scenarios faculty. I work with the National Security College of Australia, advisor to the UK all-party parliamentary group on future generations, in which capacity I supported the Ukraine 2040 scenarios, which were built with Ukrainian parliamentarians. Really, I get involved in all kinds of interesting things, but it boils down to this idea of stressed out people under pressure. In my 20s, I was a kindergarten teacher. That's actually the best training for that job. After all the other things I've done, the PhD, everything else, nothing has been so helpful to my work as a consultant as when I used to have to deal with 35-year-olds every morning, Monday through Friday.
Is that because most executives result to being children at the end of the day?
Yeah, I have to say I've had some experiences sometimes where it felt like we were going back to the playground. But I think also little kids, they learn with their bodies, with all their emotions, because they haven't yet been trained into that experience of school. Even when you're doing kindergarten, they literally bring their entire lives and their physicality to the room. And what I found actually in the early days of my executive education career at Oxford was just occasionally when something stressful happened, even in a classroom situation, there'd be a flicker of emotion or something on the face of one of the students. These people who are very senior executives, and you'd see those deep emotions we have, those almost primal emotions are still there, even in a corporate setting. And I'm sure you as well, with the career you've had, you've seen those moments when those deep, almost childish emotions come to the fore under pressure.
Oh yeah, definitely under pressure. Seeing back in that, I used to remember the challenge of trying to make decisions under that immense pressure with everything going on. And I remember seeing this guy once. He wasn't my lead. He was another platoon, and we were all sat there quite stressed because a lot was going on. And he was just sat there. This is in Helmand, by the way, and he was just sat there with a cigarette in his mouth, taking it all in. And I remember saying to him afterwards, I was like, Andy, why are you not stressed? And he goes, I am. I'm just taking it all in. And that was just funny enough you said that. But I think that's something that we overlook when we think about emotions. And strategy a lot is around emotions. And sometimes I think we can overlook that just to the product, the output of strategy, rather than actually like thinking about the emotions and stresses of what this really means.
Yeah, entirely. I think because the outputs of strategy in an organizational setting are often things like slide decks, documents, emails, we take them in with our eyes, they're visual and verbal. You forget that actually the decisions are made in the room or in a meeting like this. We bring our bodies and our emotions. And the way we understand the world is as creatures with thoughts, feelings, and physical bodies. And all of those things are in dialogue. So I think when you're going through the process of actually making the decision and owning the decision, you have to factor that into the process. Even if the output looks very polished and slick, the real world within which all that is unfolding is a world of feelings, and it's a world of bodies.
Yeah. And when you think about the output, I think that's what strategy is being boiled down to now, as an output, rather than where you look back at the history of strategy, what it was about a way of being. It's like, it's a way of constantly reorientating, understanding, what's happening, what you have, etc. And I think we're dismissing that for the product. So if I ask someone, you got a strategy, they'll yes, and they'll show me something physical. Well, that's not what I want. I want to know what's the decision making, what actually happened, what got surfaced during the process. That's what was really important.
Yeah, I completely agree. And of course, we need documentation and materials as a kind of architecture because we're often coordinating many people, many divisions, but you shouldn't be deceived into thinking the architecture is the only thing. And And I've definitely been in the experience in large organizations sometimes where the kind of lowest form of strategy is the direction has been set somewhere at the top. And then I've worked in a team where we've been told from on high, these are the 4 priorities for the coming years. And then the manager has sort of set a checklist exercise. Look at what we're already doing, see how it already fits into those 4 priorities to get the bosses off our backs, and see what we have to do to fill in the gaps. Tick, tick, tick. All right, job's done. We've covered ourselves for another 3-year cycle. And of course, we all know that's not really what decision making is about in the real world.
No. And it made me laugh because that post-rationalisation, you see it all the time. Like, you do this, you even see it in people's objectives. Like, they give the objectives at the end and then they post-rationalise what they've done for the year against these objectives. And it's the same in strategy. And I just wrote about this recently. I called it the power of the powers in the interpretation. And I don't think we make space for that interpretation. That this is what I'm thinking, and then allowing that space for someone to interpret that in their own context, what it means to them, because we all come at something with our own baggage, our own perspective, our own context, our own unique look on things, that we don't make time to surface that and really understand, well, what does this mean to me, and what do I now understand what I need to do to make this work?
Yeah, entirely. I think when you talk about that post-rationalization, it's this notion of tidying everything up and making everything reasonable, which might not even necessarily be rational. And actually, if you look back to the start of the process, both in an organizational setting, but also when we choose a home, when we choose a partner, when we make big life decisions, something happens before the rationale. And the philosopher of science, Jerry Ravitz, co-wrote a really nice paper with Rafael Ramirez, who runs the Scenarios program at Oxford, essentially talking about aesthetics, like the perception of what is beautiful and what is ugly. And they said, the first thing that happens in understanding what's going on is how you feel before you get to the thinking. And that's why we trust our guts. Most people, you can try and do what the spreadsheet tells you to do, but the reason we have a leader is because the spreadsheet can't lead. And if your gut doesn't agree with the spreadsheet, the fact is, even someone who wants to go by the numbers is going to hesitate if something in them says no at the gut level.
Yeah. And this is my concern when I'm starting to see that people outsource strategy to AI. And I've had this argument around, yes, it'll make a beautiful thing, but the same stuff that most outputs and architecture's about. It'll give you the lovely vision and the pillars, but it misses the whole gut feel, that the cognitive, affective, behavioral emotion that happens. And I think that's the thing that gets real commitment, not just a false agreement around priorities.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, what we're discovering with AI is even large language models that are really just coming up with the next word in the sentence, they can do surprising things and show you stuff that makes you think, oh, I hadn't even thought of this. But they are not intelligences in the world with bodies, with feelings. It is strings of verbiage, which might be very slick and polished, might be useful, but it isn't a thing in the world that is thinking and feeling and responding. There's other kinds of AI that are interesting, like gait analysis, like the International Olympic Committee scouting for talent by looking at how kids are moving on the soccer field, looking at video. There's other kinds of AI doing cool stuff, but I think there is this danger of remembering what is actually in the world. And I wondered for you, the diverse career experiences you've had, have there been those moments where it's been very palpable, this sense of a decision is upon me, and you kind of feel it with your whole body rather than just being this kind of PowerPoint level issue?
Yeah, like quite a lot. When we're out on operations, is always, because I grew up in it. So first operation I went on tour was 2003 when we went out to Iraq and we evaded Iraq. Funny enough, we just evaded Iran. How things come around. And I was a young kid then. I didn't really understand what was going on. I just sort of had to look after myself. And as I grew, obviously I was going back and forth to Iraq, but then I started to promote and I had senior rank. But now it changed to, it's not just me now, it's everyone around me. And I think that's where the pressure comes. It's no longer about just me. It's about, how do I look after and care for all these people but also the challenge that how do I get what we need to happen across to all these people so they understand and can interpret and act in these very volatile environments, because they're never the same. Nothing ever, I give the perfect patrol brief. As soon as we step out, things change dramatically. But then I'd always get that sense afterwards where I have a moment on my own, a condor moment, and I'll sit there and I'd like just, feel my body and my legs and be thankful that, it's still there.
Yeah, totally. When you talk about rising into that position of authority as well, the thing I think about is some of my training is in a kind of psychodynamic approach, which is a fancy way of saying what goes on within and between us in a group emotionally when we deal with a task. And there's a great thinker called Vega Zagia Roberts, and she talks about the idea that actually a leader is not at the top of the pyramid looking down, telling people where to go. And they're not even at the bottom of the pyramid holding everything up. They're more like a container for the group, and they hold the group together. But the price of that is, as the leader and the container, you feel the pressures and emotions from outside, like the pressures that might be on you from headquarters or from the wider environment. But you also feel the pressure from within the group, that the feelings and the anxieties and the personalities of your group will be affecting you. And so you kind of get it from both sides. And I wonder if there were times where you might feel something in yourself and then you'd realize, actually, that's not me. That's someone in the group or the group as a whole putting a feeling into me that I'm now feeling something on behalf of the group.
Yeah, you would, because you always get in this tension, like you said, from outside and inside the group. And, there's a lot of pressure that's given because you're given orders that you need to do. And trying to translate that to your team, especially when you're going out again and they're tired, and last thing they want to do is go out again. And especially if it's just been quite a difficult one, and then you're saying, right, we've got to kit up again, and you're trying to battle this emotion between what is right and what you want to do because it's it's palpable to do. Like, I'd love to just said, nah, just sack it, lads, just go. But I couldn't. So, even though I was like, I know they're tired, they shouldn't go, but I have to do it. It really does put that pressure and that tense. And sometimes you're trying to figure out what perspective do I need to look at this up.
Yeah, entirely. And that idea of taking different perspectives, you use that word translation. I think so much of the work is translating between the different inputs we have, the different languages, the different conflicting priorities we might be trying to resolve. And again, bringing things into language sometimes that we feel at this more instinctive or wordless level. Like, we've all had that moment. So you go, why am I feeling that? And then as you pay attention to what that feeling is, it is a signal from your body trying to tell you something you haven't yet named. I think we can get seduced by words and verbiage and what's written down and what's on the slides, and it can seduce us away from the real world where we're making decisions. But then the act of translating in and out is what kind of keeps us honest, as it were.
Yeah, and just as you were talking now, I was reflecting on, so it's really important where we developed a strategy with a team. One of the senior leaders in that team sat there and they looked and they said, how do we know this is going to work? And it was you could feel the uncertainty, and it was quite a moment, and other people weren't picking up on it. But I remember, the question I was on about was that, for who? And wondering why I was asking for who won't it work? And because I wanted to know who were they trying to demonstrate that it needed to work to, and I think that was really opened a lot of interesting dynamics between the board, between the leadership team. So that decision around, we've got to demonstrate this is going to work for the board, but also then the relationship between the wider organisation. They've had a difficult time. You can sense the growing cynicism of, not another thing. So you can really feel that they were trapped in this really tough world of trying to translate that this is going to work.
Yeah, entirely. And it sounds like your role in that as well, to be the person who noticed, paused, and then asked the right question as well. Because what I hear in that interaction is the question, for whom is this going to work? And also just the adult recognition of, once you're in the real world, the future always has an element of uncertainty. No one's going to mark your homework. life's going to play out. And in hindsight, you will have either made the right decision or the wrong decision. And you can influence that, but you don't have 100% control, which is very unnerving for all of us. And I think your ability to just hold on in that moment of discomfort is that gift, and why someone like you coming into this conversation helps the strategy to move forward is partly just noticing that silence and wondering what it means.
Yeah. And because I think that's the thing we miss, that I said it before about strategy being a way of being. You often wonder why a lot of strategy, the statistics around strategy execution is pretty poor. And then people look for the obvious things like, oh, we didn't communicate enough, or, we didn't have enough resources. It wasn't a good plan. But I don't know if people actually stop and think about, well, what emotions were holding people back.
Yeah, nicely said. There's a great mediator who has a sort of therapeutic healthcare background called Adam Carrick. And he looks at this question of like, what does the silence mean? What is going unsaid in a corporate or institutional setting? Obviously, often we don't want to bring more emotions in than are needed to. It feels wrong to get too emotional in the workplace. So sometimes people suppress those things. And then it's about developing a toolkit. There are so many different options. You could come from a therapeutic background, a coaching background, something else. Just having some kind of toolkit to be able to talk about the thing that previously couldn't be talked about seems to me key.
Yeah. Definitely when you think about, if you want people to develop, you can't force them to develop. They have to create an awareness that there's a need. And I think that's the same in strategy. You can't just go, this is what we're doing, go. There has to be some sort of buy-in, a sort of understanding, that aha moment. And I suppose that's why, just the same that futures are, the same that I view strategy as, it's an experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
This, in that philosophical line, there's this term phenomenology, like the study of experience. And it applies both to really practical elements of decision making, that actually you are always acting in a moment of experience, drawing on your past experience. But it's also a way of thinking in a sort of academic way about the future. Can you know what's going to happen before it's actually happened? I mean, you can't gather facts from events that haven't happened yet. You can't gather data from events that haven't happened yet, which of course means if you're making data-driven decisions, the uncomfortable truth is there's a faith-based element there, because you've got faith in your model. Yeah. And actually, we don't know what the future holds. I mean, maybe in a particular philosophical tradition or something, you say actually the future's already happened. I don't know. That's out of my field. But to the extent that we are living and experiencing the moment, inevitably you are intervening in an unfolding, uncertain situation. And it's like the clay is constantly wet, the clay is constantly spinning, and you're trying to touch it and nudge it towards a particular outcome, I suppose.
And I think that experience interaction, that constant interaction, is where, I really want strategy to go back to, that we move away from this sort of, it's almost come like an unemotive product. And it's like, right, we've done our strategy now. This is our Greek villa. We've done everyone knows the slide. We've done our vision statement. We've done the priorities. We've done the town hall. And it's just a series of a process, not an experience. And where I want to get back to is its constant way of being, that we are, like you said, the clay is always wet. We haven't stopped. Yes, we've given the initial direction, but we're constantly orientating, deciding, to the changing circumstances as information or opportunities or new affordances evolve and show themselves.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And the good thing is, I think that ultimately people, as individuals and groups and even wider organizations, ultimately they go with what works. So if you do find organizations with excessively formal and rigid strategies, you probably find people tinkering and improvising and doing things around the edges, or even sometimes the strategy might be there on the website to download, but the real strategy is being worked out on the corner of a restaurant tablecloth, with people in a back room or something like that.
Yeah.
And so the question is always, what do you need formally to organize the work effectively that has the right degree of flexibility, but also doesn't overly formalize? I mean, we've all heard the joke about, some people would rather drown clutching a good plan than let go of the plan and swim. And yet, of course, beyond a certain number of people, beyond, a half dozen people or something like that, you need some elements in place just to steer by. I don't know what you found in terms of giving people a bit of direction without building the whole Greek villa. What do you find most effective?
Well, I think you go back to this point that I think we lazily view an organisation as a whole rather than, people have different contexts in the organisation. So they are, separate entities. But the way that, we've always done it in the sense what I'm used to is that we have clear intent. So you must have the clear intent. This is what we need. We have some constraints. So these are the clear, and they're not too over prescribed, but they're just enough to make sure that the whole thing doesn't go apart. And then some context. So I always talk about, I went to Afghan for 8 months with a sheet of paper. Right. All I needed. And it's very volatile, so always changing, but it's all I needed. But what has to come with that is the back brief, which is right, now I've told you this stuff, I want you to go away and go think about what I've asked you to do, and then come back, and I want you to tell me what you're doing, what you're thinking, what you're wrestling with, what you're unsure about, where do you think you're over constrained, and we'll have a conversation. And we call this, funny enough, in the army, we call this command and control. But if you look in civilian world, command and control is a horrible thing. I just saw Rita McGrath put something up about we need to move away from command and control, and I'm like, well, to us that's a good thing,
right?
But yeah.
Well, as we know, different sectors use language in different ways, and sometimes the same term means complete different things in different settings. I think the thing I really pick up from what you're saying and about the back brief as well is, of course, it makes everything relational. That there is this back and forth. And again, I think when there is uncertainty unfolding around us, the question is really that network of relationships, which is the organization, how can it make decisions it can live with collectively and effectively implement them? And part of it is to look at this relationality, this element of we are different beings connecting with one another. There is give and take at every stage. No one is simply sort of receiving from on high and just absorbing the directive and then also just taking things in from the screen. And again, that brings us back to this question of emotions, embodiment, and even like that physical element of perspective of depending on where you stand. I've done whole of organization consultations and retreats before, and actually it is often talking to admin staff, security staff, the people who are not high in the hierarchy in terms of decision responsibility, but they see things about the organization that others may not have missed. And finding the right way to bring those perspectives into the strategic conversation can be key, as well as helping everyone feel ownership of, we're on this collective journey.
Yeah. And that back brief is really important for that, because it gives the center to understand what the edges see, and allow the edges to understand what the center sees, and it's relational. But one thing that I think really impacts that relational element of organizations is that we self-create ambiguity. So to come with that, you want an organization where you've got the clear roles. So I know that team is responsible for that. That's what they do. That person is the person that makes a decision about that. That's what their decision. Where I think that we've almost come into this point in organizations where it's not done in a logical sense. Like we've got team A, B, and C. They're just lumped together because it just makes it easier for the reporting. Or we've now got over here. We've got Sandra looks after this team because Dave wasn't good enough, but instead of dealing with that, we're just going to move things over. Or they've gotten to a point where this new age of organizational design, which is like they don't want any design, it's polymorphic, it'll just emerge, which really destroys the relational point, because who do I go to? Who do I have that conversation with? Which I think is really important.
Yeah, I think when we think about roles have boundaries which become really important. We never get everything immaculate in the world. So there'll always be tension and ambiguity and some overlaps just because it's humans relating to one another. But a sense of role, a sense of what that role encompasses. And again, it comes to the idea that when you take up a role, inevitably, there will be external and internal pressures upon you. You'll feel those. It might be a negative thing. It might feel like stage fright or dread at the burden of it. But also you can get into these weird moments of euphoria. You know, you see people who power goes to their heads, even good people. Herbert Simon, who was a scientist of cognition, he's sometimes called the father of AI, working in the middle of the 20th century. He wrote a really good memoir about his scholarly career and having this very impressive scholarly career. And one of the really good self-reflective takeaways he has is he says, it took me a long time to understand that as a person in authority, I could invite people to challenge me and mean it, but some of them just wouldn't because they thought this is going to do my career in if I go head to head with the boss. And even with goodwill, he didn't understand the aura that his role brought, that people didn't dare to challenge him.
Yeah, and that's an inevitable thing. People look at power and think all power's bad, but some actually, you know, it's not all power's bad. You know, how you utilize power can determine that. But that's an inevitable thing, and you're not going to get away with it. And I think a lot of people try and focus and answer this. That's why they get so obsessed around things like psychological safety. If that's suddenly going to be the silver bullet that does it, but there's always going to be there. You just need to be aware of it and pick up. Once you know about it, you can find a different way of approaching it.
Yeah.
Challenge them.
Entirely, absolutely. One of the most useful things anyone's ever said to me, almost in a single sentence. I was at a thing called a group relations conference a while back, which is where you observe how people behave under pressure in groups. You're really thrown in the deep end for 2 or 3 days and subjected to all kinds of pressures. And people, you just all observe one another and how you respond to pressure. And I was in a small group that was having real trouble delegating authority to a leader. We basically had the job of, we were going to send someone out of a room and they could make a decision on our behalf and we had no control over what they did. They were going to sign us up to a commitment, whether we liked it or not. And we had a lot of anxiety about this and how many parameters did we need to give them and everything else, and should we even delegate that power to one person? And then Patrick Mandicate came in, who's a group relations consultant. He's worked in HM prisons, very used to stressful situations. He was looking in on the process and came in for a word of advice. And he said, you know, authority is just a tool. You can pick it up and you can put it down, and, you know, you can hand it off to someone else when it's needed, when it's appropriate to the conditions. And we all suddenly relaxed because we felt like we were electing a dictator, and actually we were handing someone a tool to do a job for a certain period of time. It was such a good reframe.
Yeah. And that's it. And I think I remember taking over Batum once, and they had quite a dictator in beforehand that had to make all the decisions. Excuse me. And what it meant was when I took over, people wouldn't make a decision. They'll come to me, and I just had to reframe it all the time. Like, you're there to do a job. What's your job? And it wasn't in a challenging way, like, you know, go away, only come to me with answers, not problems, or whatever the quaint thing. It was really just getting back to their identity within the group.
Yeah.
Like, what's your identity in this group, and what have I entrusted you to do for me? And I'll be used to tell him, I'm an idiot, mate. Like, you're the one that knows. You tell me, and we'll have this conversation. And it really worked, and you could see it in a matter of, you know, days and weeks, how the dynamics change. Occasionally, I have to reframe it back because they would go back into habit, but you just frame it back. You go, okay, what's your part do you play in this?
Yeah, nicely said.
Yeah.
And I think it comes back to this idea of, as a leader, as a container. Within that container, people can have a lot of autonomy, a lot of responsibility, as long as they know that you've ultimately got them. And what it makes me reflect on is Ryan Ramsey, a former submarine captain who used to teach Perisher, which was the submarine captain's course in the Royal Navy. And he would talk about the role of being a captain of a submarine, because obviously in a submarine, you don't have contact often with HQ. So everything falls upon the captain ultimately when they're on operations. And the things he said were, one of them was, show people you can do everything competently once, and then let them get on with it. Show them that you can drive the submarine reasonably well. Show them you know how the nuclear reactor works, but then it's their job because they're the experts, but now they trust you. And then he also talks about the time when you do have to be the container, that when he was captaining HMS Turbulent, the systems began to fail because they were in the Middle East and it was simply too hot. So actually, even elements of the life support started to fail. things were going terribly wrong, people were getting heat stroke, and he had to make the decision, having radioed back. And he jokingly says, maybe I didn't impress how bad the situation was because they just trusted me to make my own judgment call. But they ended up diving in a submarine where the systems were failing on the assumption that the colder water at depths would actually solve a lot of the problems and let them fix the systems. But in his memoir about this, he's written about it. He says that the truth is, I wasn't sure. It was uncertain. You couldn't look in a manual and say, will this definitely work if the systems start failing under the heat? The submarine had been built for the North Atlantic and was being used in the Middle East. And ultimately, that is when you don't delegate. You take responsibility. You might talk to your trusted team. You might get the feedback and the response and accept the challenge. But leadership is also about that responsibility. And again, it comes back to that feeling. You can only imagine the emotions going through someone when they have to make that call with confidence and authority.
Yeah. It really comes to everything being about attention. Too easy to say that it's one or the other, but it's attention. It's it's a spectrum. One of those for organizations is always around control and autonomy. How much control and how much autonomy do I need to give? But again, it's contextual. And you always find in points of crisis, you'll expect to see the tension shift to more control. Inevitably, the crisis, you have to make that decision. And you never know. If anyone said that they made a decision because they ultimately knew everything, is a liar. We don't know. We have, again, that, gut, that motion that will tell us. But then, again, it's that experience that once we start doing it, we know what we're looking for. Like, I know this is the right decision if I start to see these outcomes. And if I'm not seeing those outcomes, then I know I need to then adapt or make a different decision. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's where, as we prepare to take these decisions and as we go through life holding different kinds of authority, there's this weird way of you can pull in other parts of your life and it gives you good training for the work. So John Kay, who was at Sci Business School, talks a lot about obliquity, which means kind of getting to things by an indirect route. So one of the things I found has helped me deal with this idea of fulfilling an intent or a goal is, amongst my weird hobbies, I'm a glass blower. And with glass blowing, at the beginning, okay, I'm going to try and make a glass or a vase or something else. You start this process. As you gather the molten glass, you can't be sure how that particular gather is going to behave. You start to shape it. You're turning the pipe as well. The tools themselves get hot from touching the glass. So even your point of contact with them, you have to manage so you don't burn yourself. And slowly, the thing unfolds in line with what you're intending to do, but you don't have absolute control over how the material behaves. You don't even have absolute control if, something's going to turn out to be too hot for you to touch when you didn't expect it to be. And the thing that really stuck with me, I'm really mindful that these things can sound really trite when you're pulling these metaphors, but it genuinely made me think differently. I had once, when I was learning, almost finished a glass that was really good. And at the last moment when we were handing it off, dropped it on the concrete, and it was still soft enough. It smushed instead of breaking. The air started to turn blue with my curses. And the teacher, supremely chill, said, it's still soft, we can save that. So we quickly heated up another pipe, got it back up off the concrete floor and spun it back into shape because the material was still malleable. And there's a saying in glassblowing, if you want to understand someone's talent as a glassblower, they say it's not what you make, it's what you save. It's the ability to correct the unforeseen or unwanted error more than just achieving what you thought you would from the outset that really shows the measure of a glassblower. And something about that very immersive physical experience for me, again, it's one of those things that can teach you a lot about being in the room with people who have a decision to make.
Yeah. And I think that's, really, as an analogy, is on point. We talk about strategy, we talk about trajectory. We know where we want to go, ideally. We know what we want to change, what effect we're trying to have on our point in the external environment. But, how we get there is never going to be linear. There may be times where it is going perfectly lovely, but then certain things can happen and can throw it all up into the air. I bet there's a few people waking up at the weekend thinking, Jesus Christ, I had stuff planned, now it's not happening. But it's that ability to observe, to orientate what's happening, to then think, okay, so what options do I have now?
Yeah, absolutely. And being smart and creative about generating new options as well. I mean, as I said, I know you were on the Oxford Scenarios program, and the point of that is precisely to develop alternative assessments of where the context might go. And it's not that you're predicting the future. It is this, we've used this word before, reframe, seeing the same context differently based on how the uncertainties might play out. I don't know if you've got particular experiences or thoughts, or where you've had this experience of kind of seeing the world from a different perspective, like seeing the context afresh and going, oh, actually, I interpret that differently now. Is there something there where you've had that experience?
All the time. Yeah, all the time. I think we used to do it quite instinctively anyway, but it's not until recent years that I really made sure I'd done it. But we'd have it all the time where we'd have to see it from different perspectives, because we'd see it from our perspective around, well, actually, I'll go back to one where I wish we did see it from different perspectives. I think and I hope they don't make the same mistake in Iran, in the same with Iraq and Afghanistan, especially Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a major strategic mistake in the sense of not being able to reframe it and see it from a different perspective. Because we went there and thinking that we could bring democracy and, all this lovely, wonderful stuff that, of course, they would want because it's been so great in the Western world. But we weren't willing to see it from the perspective from them and think, what do they want? And it was, you remember sitting there with some tribal elders and talking to them around what they wanted. That was really, from that point, it really stuck to me. But I was thinking, you think that I'm doing here, or we're trying to do here, is at odds with what they want. And at that point, I was thinking, I don't know how I can reconcile the difference.
Yeah. It comes back to this idea of translation a bit, doesn't it? This word we've used before. And I think people sometimes think listening is passive, but actually, often the interpretation that goes on when you really listen to something, it actually changes your map of the territory and what's going on, and particularly of what is valued. And of course, the experience you have is interesting precisely because military operations actually happen within a world of politics, society, culture, economics. All this stuff that is outside the frame of military conflict is actually totally embedded in it. But then as someone on an operation, you're also physically there, and it's also very palpable. So it's almost like you can see all those layers folded into a single conversation that you were having, and the need to listen to the elder rather than simply dictate. It comes back to this idea of relationality, I guess.
Yeah. And it's the same when you're in organizations. And I do this a lot because I've come in as strategy advisor. You know what it means. Like, you come in strategy, but if you can do anything strategy that affects the organization. So I'd like to spend my time going around, not just stuck in that boardroom, listening to what they're doing. I like to go down and sit, I suppose, a bit like the elders. I like to go and sit with the different departments and teams and see it from their perspective about how are they translating what's happening into their world, and what does that mean? And I don't think we can, once you start doing that, you start to see the different emotions come in. And, and it's lazy. Everyone just goes, oh, it's management versus, the workers. Well, no, there's more to it. And it's trying to figure out what is the perspective? What is the demand? What is the expectations? What is the thing that can't be reconciled, that exists? I think this really brings a lot. And it's not going, well, we're going to change the strategic direction, because a lot of that isn't, a lot of people think it's internally driven, but a lot of it's externally driven. We need to do this because we need to be viable. So, well, how can we enable the translation to happen? How can we surface that emotion in a useful way that we can actually sort of move forward?
Yeah, nicely said. I think of, again, this philosopher of science, Jerome Rabbits. He uses the word contradiction to mean a problem that can't be resolved within the current frame of reference. And you have to rethink to get rid of the contradiction. Something that seems an impossible problem to solve, if you reframe it, you see it differently. Again, the very trite classic example often from negotiation studies is the two siblings come to the mum asking for an orange, and in the end, the mum just cuts it in half. One of them just wants the fruit and eats the fruit and throws away the peel. The other one just wanted the peel to put it in a cake. And they both could have had everything they wanted from the orange, but the mum was like, we're just going to cut it in half. That idea of imposing a logic, even turning up with the logic of the problem must be management versus the workers or whatever, versus really listening, as you do, to the different parts of an organization. And also not just to what is said, but what is unsaid. What is this making me feel? Looking at body language, looking at the silences, what is being brought up in me that might not actually be my own emotion, but something that they are triggering that actually might belong to the wider organization. I don't know if you've had those moments of kind of an intuition or a gut feeling.
Yeah, and I have it a lot, when I'm different, going around speaking to different teams and stuff. And what I always notice a lot, and I always listen to, is that I'll get loads of people telling me about how constrained they are, and how they can't do something because of this, this constraint. And right, some of those are overly prescriptive due to the risk tolerance of an organization. But then again, I think, well, what freedoms do you have? And they think, they go, well, now that this thing is changing, what freedoms does that give you? Or if you had to look at it and go, well, what haven't they told you can't do? What is that? And I think it's opens up that conversation, because I'm not saying to them, you're wrong. You can still do it with these constraints. I'm going, okay, that's perfectly perfectly understandable. But what freedoms do you have? I think changes that, it reframes it and has a different sort of emotion of, okay, let's look at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, entirely. I think freedom of interpretation is that great liberty at every rank in an organization. Of course, as you say, there are pressures and constraints and all kinds of things which can't be belittled or put to one side. But the extent to which one can interpret what is going on, one has been asked to do, and one's own assessment, there's often some wiggle room there. The other thing I was thinking about was, I remember consulting to an organization once, and again, at this level of almost something that felt intuitive, there were two senior figures, and they come in the room early before this workshop, and they start talking about, first of all, about Oxford versus Cambridge and the boat race. And I was like, okay, I felt like they were trying to trigger something in me or have a go or something. And they said, oh, this person's been to Cambridge. Don't know how you feel about that, Matt. And I sort of, it sort of passed me by, really. It didn't bother me. And then they tried again. They talked about Lamborghini and Ferrari, and they were going on. And it took me a while. And then you realize these two figures actually had quite a severe rivalry going on, but at this weird level in the company where it sort of went unspoken, and they were jockeying with one another, and they were somehow trying to trigger something in me to make it my problem or my bad feeling, or also let me know this can be framed as a rivalry. And then you have the choice. Do I go with that? Do I do something else with it? Do I ignore it? Do I name it, or do I try and offer an alternative? But gradually, this kind of intuitive ability to work with what's not being said directly, I think, can be incredibly helpful when it comes to this question of strategy.
Yeah, I think so. Especially even when you look back on the old days of the general, back in, the 16th century, where we didn't have this technology, we didn't have data, and we didn't have a Power BI board there to tell me what aggregated data of how people are doing. And that's the problem. It's an aggregated data of how people are doing in an organization. Because you didn't have that, the great generals and the leaders would walk in the evening to the tents to understand how the men were feeling, what they were thinking, and all this stuff. And I think that that's where we need to move away from this drawer of things telling me what it is, rather than taking that time to actually listen, to understand, and to be in the place where I can feel that emotion and I can hear that emotion, or I can see that emotion, rather than just looking for some green lights on a board.
Yeah, entirely. I think that question of when a metric is useful and what is the right metric, because obviously a metric is a distillation of reality. So of course we don't go without them, but really understanding what they are, what their limits are, when they're useful and when they're not, is a big part of it. And the other thing is, as I said, there's so many approaches to theorizing about what am I feeling, and it doesn't almost matter if you choose one psychological approach or the other. The point is actually that you just try. And again, I come back to Adam Carrick, this mediator, and he talks about these two things, bracketing and horizontalizing. They're not his, they're used more widely, but he was the one who communicated them to me. The bracketing one is just as you sit there going, I'm going to notice what I'm noticing. Whatever signal my body is giving me or my intuitions are giving me, I'm going to actually really listen out and say, what is that thing? What is it doing to me? What does it mean? Do I want to do something with it or ignore it or change it? So the one side is this bracketing to get really specific about the data that your own emotions and your physicality are giving you. And the other one is horizontalizing, which is kind of the opposite, which is if you're getting fixated on one thing, say, well, actually, what else am I taking in? Try and take in all the sensory inputs. And we've all had it. I mean, I've been in rooms where you feel like the temperature drops, and you're like, oh, this was a chilling silence. What's that about? Who's it come from? Who has chilled the room and why? What are they trying to silence? And again, it's this very visceral feeling.
Yeah. I really like those ideas, especially that horizontal thing, because we can get ourselves into that point where we just fixate on something and we go, well, I always think about what else am I missing?
Yeah,
and
entirely.
Trying to broaden it out to think about, well, if I'm focused on this, what else am I missing?
Yeah.
Brings back to that politics that people play, and what's the real game? Because we can always just look at the surface thing that's going along, but what's the real game behind it all? And I think that's the thing that you can start to draw on.
Yeah. Curiosity is an incredibly useful resource. And although I'm sure in theory you could become over curious, the reality is maintaining that kind of suspended questioning frame of mind. The great therapist Irvin Yalom, he once said when he had a patient who he got really stuck with, he'd say, why am I more curious about you than you are about yourself? And I think when you're consulting to organizations, when you hit that wall, you can sometimes present that question to the client and say, why am I more curious about this thing that you don't want to touch? But I wanted to come back for a second to this question of role as well and the feeling in the body, because we talked about the idea of taking up a role and taking up authority. And something that struck me, I wondered if you talk about looking at your career. You've talked before about, putting on a uniform as a kid because of the inspiration of your father and the feeling you had of putting on a uniform and only being allowed to wear the uniform at home when you couldn't wear it out on the street in Ireland. And then later on in life, the discomfort you felt putting on a uniform that was like a signal to you saying, oh God, I need to do something about this. I wondered if you could talk a bit about the feeling, because the uniform represents a role. There was something your body was telling you on both occasions about your relationships.
That's about your identity. Back then, my whole identity was as a soldier and proud to be that soldier. And I think it was that sort of, I suppose, that disassociation that came in between what my identity was and what I was feeling. They were becoming separated. And that's why I knew, and to me, that's why I knew something was wrong, because I've always wanted, as I said, as a kid, I always wanted to be a soldier, and then I was a soldier. And then when I got to the point, that's the point where I really knew that something was wrong and that I was not in a great place. And then I had my breakdown there. But I think that identity is really important, that people have, and that feeling that it comes with it. And I think there's that point where, I suppose, if you've got the identity and you've got that role, and suddenly something's not right, and you're getting that emotion about there's a difference here, then that's where you probably look and think, well, something's changed. And if you think about an organization thing, it's that something's changed because our identity is not now fitting with the environment we're in, and it's been challenged. On a personal one, it's the same. There's something happening internally or externally that is different, and it's causing this disassociation. And where I did was I avoided it massively, and I didn't want to know about it. And unfortunately, by not challenging it, not being curious about it, it led to me having a breakdown, where I think that those things are really important signs to be curious of, rather than to avoid. And I think we often avoid those, even in organizations, when things aren't quite right and something's pulling it apart. It's almost too sensitive for us to challenge, so we avoid the conversation and until it's too late.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's actually the true measure of courage. It's a bit like the glass blowing story, is to go through the crisis, particularly the crisis of identity. It strikes me also at the organizational level, Trudy Lang at the Saïd Business School at Oxford talks about identity and strategy and says, sometimes people think, well, the identities are given. We've inherited the identity. Now it's just the question of strategy. What are we going to do? And she points out at an organizational level, who we might need to be in a changing context is also something that's in play when we're making leadership decisions. So actually, one might do organizational strategy, but one might also change and evolve the identity. And that might include relinquishing things as well. You know, the example I always find funny is Serco, the services company that does all kinds of things, up to and including running offshore detention centres in Australia, began as a cinema cleaning company, a branch of an American cinema corporation. In the 30s, they cleaned cinemas. During World War II, they were brought in to do sort of technical stuff relating to sound and lighting that was part of the military attempts to sort of find different ways of conducting war in World War II. After the war, they were basically assigned to maintain stations like monitoring stations and so on, because they'd been cleaning cinemas and stuff before. And you watch the evolution of this organization. If you'd have told them in the 30s that, you know, 50 years from now, you'll still be around, there'll be a management buyout, but you'll be a services consulting company to the public sector. But we clean cinemas. You know, the question of who we are is a really unusual one, and it is oriented towards the future. We're not finished becoming who we're going to be next, and I think that's a massive challenge, but it's also a great opportunity.
Yeah, I did see an organisation is absolutely crucial in the sense that, and so I want to pick up with Trudy when I get a chance to speak to her, because I've been looking at this a lot around organisational identity and why it's important. Because when you make a strategy decision, you should always think about the question: would we like what we become? Because as soon as and that's the same with me when I was medically discharged, had to leave the army, I've got to look at my options that are available to me and what options I'll take, but understanding that those options are going to change me. They're going to give me new identity, and I've got to then decide, would I like what I become? And I think that's a really important strategic question that we don't think about, is the fact there's got all these options, but how's it going to impact our identity as an organisation?
Yeah, completely. And it comes back to this question of foresight. To my mind, a really mature foresight practice or strategic practice under uncertainty is in dialogue with the future. So instead of thinking in my arrogance in 2026, I definitely know which future I want and who I need to become. The other thing you can say is, well, if the future plays out differently, if it plays out in ways I didn't expect or assume, in hindsight, will I look back well on the decision I'm making today? You know, the thing that I think is so wise and good in 2026, in hindsight, will that still seem so wise and good? And I think this question can take you a long way, because if you ask people, how do you think this decision will be remembered? They don't just evaluate the decision, they tell you something about their assumptions regarding the future, which is going to do that remembering. And I think it's a useful way of reflecting on these changes.
Yeah. And I think that really brings to the heart of that stewardship of an organisation. You being the right steward for that organisation to where it needs to go. And I do think that the idea of identity, purpose is people talk about purpose, but what I'm talking about is real purpose. What does this organisation do? What's his identity? We all have one. Some leaders, like you said, some are inherited, but we've got to respect that. And we've got to look at the past and think, well, what decisions got us to this point? Because they're just as great to know, because that will then constrain what's possible for the future.
I agree. We're just this element of translation. I mean, the similarity that the past and the future both have is they're not now, and we can only get access to them through stories and data and documents and so on. So as we tell the story of who we were and tell the story of who we're going to be, it's translating between 3 points in time, past, present, and future. It makes total sense. I think just the one thing I want to bring in as we come towards the close is this question of listening to the body and not just thinking about words. And again, weirdly, without being trite, the more you do with your body, the more you recognize what is a weird signal and what is not. So actually, you know, as you and I have talked before about these things, that different activities like horse riding, dancing, and skiing, for example, it's totally different whether you put your weight on the inside or the outside leg when you turn. Things that feel counterintuitive turn out to be the right thing to do. I always think with skiing, you know, wait a second, I have to lean more downhill to have more control of this sliding down this icy slope. One of the things you can do is sort of really train your body to identify these signals and not just go with the default assumption of what intuitively feels right. And I think it's good to be challenging ourselves, even in terms of what do I hear and not hear when I listen to my own body in these situations, these rooms where we have difficult conversations that lead to consequential decisions.
Yeah, I mean, that's really powerful, you know, to really just take that time. I always say step away from the fog, you know, and start to think about in that, you know, what's what do you think is intuitive and what isn't? It brings you back to the days of learning to shoot in the army, and you'd get up a position. What they used to make us do was to run forward and suddenly stop. And where you stopped on, that was your lead foot. And so it's all about actually how do we use that intuitive sense to actually build up a good platform. That's really good. Just before we leave, Matt, is there anything you'd like to leave people to think about from this episode to go away and think about more about?
Yeah, so it is literally about the fact that at any given moment, we think, we feel emotions, and we have a physical presence. All of those things are giving us information and giving something out into the world. And I think the interesting thing, again, I'm really praising Adam Carrick here, but it's well deserved. He talks about the idea that essentially the thing that improves your ability to use these tools is the fact that you make an effort with them. So it almost doesn't matter what school of thought, if you're coming from coaching, facilitation, psychotherapy, or anything else. The mere act of attending to the idea that thoughts, emotions, and physicality are all in play when we have a strategic conversation, that will develop your capacity to use them in an effective way.
Yeah, I like that. And one thing I always say to leaders as well is that I could teach you anything you want if you wanted to and about strategy, but there has to be a will. If there's no will, there's nothing. No, I think that was great. And I'll link your details so that people can get in touch with you. It's absolutely fantastic. And hopefully when you're back and you're actually in Oxford, I'd love to actually meet up in person because I'm only down the road in Milton Keynes, so it'd be great.
Sounds absolutely delightful. It's real joy talking with you. I was looking forward to this, so thank you so much, Mike. And yeah, been really fun.
That was awesome. Made my week, and I look forward to catching up with you soon. Thank you very much.
Take care for now.